He thought she was just a decoration, an elegant accessory to hang on his arm, draped in diamonds and designer silk, a silent testament to his success. He was Jonathan Sterling, a titan of industry, and she was his wife. At the glittering 10th anniversary gala for his company in front of New York's elite, he decided to make an example of her, to humiliate her for a perceived slight to break her spirit before the woman he was flaunting on the side. He forced her to her knees. But Jonathan forgot one crucial detail. Decorations can be deceiving, and the quietest people often forge the sharpest steel. The diamonds felt like ice against Annalise Sterling's skin. Each of the 27 stones in the Eternity's Cascade necklace, a gift from her husband Jonathan for their 12th anniversary, seemed to sap the warmth from her body. From the penthouse suite of their Park Avenue apartment, the city lights of Manhattan sprawled below like a fallen galaxy, a breathtaking view that had once filled her with wonder. Now, it just felt like the glittering bars of a very expensive cage. Jonathan stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the knot of his silk brioni tie. He was a man sculpted by ambition and arrogance. His reflection showed a handsome, powerful figure in a custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, a man who believed the world was his for the taking. He had taken it, and in the process he had taken her. "Is the car ready?" he asked, his voice clipped, not bothering to look at her. "It's been waiting for 10 minutes, Jonathan." Annalise replied, her own voice a carefully modulated calm. She had learned years ago that any hint of emotion, frustration, sadness, anger, was a currency he refused to trade in. He only dealt in submission and admiration. He finally turned his gaze, sweeping over her. She wore a deep sapphire gown by Oscar de la Renta that clung to her form, a masterpiece of fabric and design. Her auburn hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and the cold diamonds rested against the hollow of her throat. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. It wasn't love or even appreciation. It was ownership. The look a man gives his prized sports car before showing it off at a rally. "You look acceptable." He conceded the faint praise a sharper cut than any overt insult. "Remember, tonight is crucial. Alistair Finch is attending. His fund's continued investment is paramount. So you will smile, you will be charming, and you will not, under any circumstances, embarrass me." Annalise simply nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. Embarrass him? That had become her primary function, or rather the avoidance of it. She was the perfect corporate wife, a ghost in silk, who could host a dinner for 50 without a single flaw, who remembered the names of every investor's children, who could discuss art and politics with effortless grace. Her own soul was quietly eroding. Their marriage hadn't always been a frozen tundra. She remembered a younger Jonathan, a man with fire in his eyes, and dreams that were big enough for two. They had met in college. She was an art history major with a modest inheritance, and he was a brilliant business student with nothing but a ferocious drive. It was her inheritance, a sum she had never imagined would be so significant, that had provided the seed money for his first venture, Sterling Innovations. He'd promised her the world, and in a way he'd delivered. He just hadn't mentioned she would be living in it alone. The cracks had started as hairline fractures. A late night at the office became a weekend trip he forgot to mention. His compliments turned to critiques. His passion was replaced by a cold, transactional distance. Then came the whispers, the knowing glances from other women in their social circle, the scent of an unfamiliar perfume on his jacket. For the past year, it had been more than whispers. It was a name, Talia Vance, a younger, brasher woman with platinum blonde hair and an insatiable appetite for the life Annalise currently led. Jonathan wasn't even discreet. He was seen with Talia at exclusive restaurants, on private jets, at charity auctions. He was daring Annalise to challenge him to create a scene. He wanted a reason to discard her, but he was too concerned with the public relations nightmare of a messy divorce. A titan of industry couldn't have his carefully constructed image tarnished. He needed his graceful, silent wife by his side. For now. Annalise wasn't a fool. She hadn't been idle. While Jonathan saw her as a passive ornament, she had been quietly moving her own chess pieces across the board. Her old college friend, Genevieve Thorne, was now one of the most feared forensic accountants and corporate lawyers in the city. For 6 months, they had been working in the shadows, tracing the intricate web of shell corporations and offshore accounts Jonathan had created. He thought he was siphoning money from his company to fund his lavish lifestyle with Talia. He was. But he had made a critical error. He had forgotten who had signed the initial incorporation documents, whose name was on the foundational investment charter as a silent, non-executive partner, with specific clauses Genevieve had insisted upon. 12 years ago, clauses a younger, eager Jonathan had signed without a second thought. Tonight was the 10th anniversary gala of Sterling Innovations. It was being held in the Grand Imperial Ballroom of the Saint, Regis, a monument to old New York wealth and power. It was meant to be Jonathan's coronation, a celebration of his genius and success. He had no idea it was going to be his execution. Annalise picked up her small beaded clutch from the marble-topped dresser. Inside, nestled between her lipstick and a silk handkerchief, was a tiny encrypted USB drive. It was a copy of everything. The original was with Genevieve. "Let's go," Jonathan said, striding towards the door. "It's my night. Try to look happy for me." Annalise took one last look at her reflection. The woman staring back was pale, her eyes holding a deep, sorrowful resolve. She wasn't happy. She was far beyond that. She was ready. She straightened her shoulders, the weight of the diamonds, suddenly feeling less like a burden and more like armor. She followed her husband out of the gilded cage, walking toward the grandest ballroom in the city, which she intended to turn into his personal slaughterhouse. The Grand Imperial Ballroom was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of beautifully dressed people. The air hummed with the murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the gentle melodies of a string quartet. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved like ghosts through the crowd, offering canapés of caviar and lobster. It was a room drowning in wealth and influence, and at its center, Jonathan Sterling was king. He moved through his subjects with a practiced ease, a hand on this person's shoulder, a shared laugh with that one. Annalise remained by his side, a perfect, smiling automaton. She greeted Mr. Henderson from the board, inquired after Mrs. Beaumont's recent trip to Monaco, and complimented a young tech billionaire on his latest acquisition. She played her part flawlessly, the picture of supportive grace. "Jonathan, Annalise. Wonderful to see you." The voice was deep and carried an authority that cut through the surrounding chatter. It belonged to Alistair Finch, a man who represented old money and true power. His firm, Finch Capital, was one of the largest investors in Sterling Innovations. He was a silver-haired man in his late 60s with shrewd, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Alistair, so glad you could make it." Jonathan boomed, his smile widening. A spectacular turnout, isn't it? Indeed, Alistair said, his eyes shifting to Annalise. Unlike most, his gaze held genuine warmth and respect. Annalise, you look magnificent. That sapphire is a perfect match for your eyes. Thank you, Alistair. It's lovely to see you looking so well. She replied, the first genuine smile of the evening touching her lips. Alistair had always been kind to her, seeing her not as an extension of Jonathan, but as a person in her own right. They had often found themselves in quiet corners at these events, discussing European art or classic literature. A brief respite from the suffocating superficiality. It is your planning that makes these events such a success, my dear Alistair continued, giving Jonathan a pointed look. A man is only as great as the woman who stands beside him. Jonathan is a very lucky man. Jonathan's smile tightened at the edges. He hated when anyone praised Annalise. It detracted from his own spotlight. Well, I do my best to give her a fine canvas to work with, he said, a dismissive wave of his hand encompassing the entire ballroom. Before Alistair could respond, a ripple of movement near the grand entrance drew their attention. The whispers started instantly, a subtle hiss that spread through the room like a contagion. Annalise didn't need to look. She felt the change in the atmosphere, the sudden dip in temperature. Talia Vance had arrived. She was a spectacle in crimson red, a dress so audacious it was practically a declaration of war. It was cut low in the front and high on the thigh, a stark, vulgar contrast to the understated elegance of the other women in the room. Her platinum hair was styled in glamorous waves, and a diamond necklace one Annalise recognized from a recent charge on a credit card statement she wasn't supposed to see glittered at her throat. She wasn't just a guest. She was an invasion. Jonathan's composure for the first time that evening cracked. A flash of annoyance crossed his face, quickly replaced by a smirk of arrogant defiance. He had invited her. Annalise knew it instantly. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated move. It was a power play designed to humiliate her on the biggest stage possible. Talia's eyes scanned the room and locked onto their group. She began to walk towards them, a predatory sway in her hips. The crowd subtly parted before her guests, turning their heads to watch the impending collision. Penelope Croft, the city's most voracious society columnist, was already tapping furiously on her phone, her eyes alight with malevolent glee. Jonathan. Who is that young woman? Alistair Finch asked, his voice low and laced with disapproval. He knew exactly who she was. The entire room did. The question was a test. Jonathan's jaw set. That's Talia Vance, a marketing consultant who has done some excellent work for the company. Talia arrived before them, her perfume, a heavy, cloying scent enveloping them. Johnny darling, she purred, completely ignoring Annalise and Alistair. She placed a possessive hand on Jonathan's arm, her red nails like drops of blood against his black tuxedo. I was so afraid I'd be late. You didn't start the speeches without me, did you? The use of the pet name, Johnny, was a deliberate intimacy, a claim staked in public territory. The collective intake of breath in their immediate vicinity was almost audible. Annalise stood perfectly still, her face a mask of serene neutrality. Inside, a cold fire was burning, incinerating the last vestiges of any lingering sentiment she might have had for her husband. This was more than an affair. This was a public execution. Jonathan, buoyed by Talia's fawning and the attention of the crowd, seemed to swell with self-importance. He made a fatal error. He mistook his wife's silence for weakness. He thought she was cowed, defeated. Talia. "This is Alistair Finch," Jonathan said, making the introduction. He then gestured vaguely towards his wife, an afterthought. "And you know my wife, Annalise." Talia's eyes, the color of cold champagne, flickered over Annalise with blatant contempt. "Oh, yes," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "The famous hostess. I've heard so much about your arrangements." It was a direct, vicious jab, and Annalise felt Alistair stiffen beside her. But she did not rise to the bait. She simply inclined her head, slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement so regal and dismissive it seemed to momentarily throw Talia off balance. "I'm sure you have," Annalise said, her voice soft but clear. The tension was suffocating. Jonathan, however, was reveling in it. He was the sun, and these two women were planets orbiting him, vying for his light. He placed his hand over Talia's, a gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by anyone, least of all Alistair Finch, whose expression was now one of undisguised disgust. "Well," Alistair said, his tone clipped. "If you'll excuse me, I need to speak with my portfolio manager." He gave Annalise a brief apologetic nod and turned on his heel, striding away without another word to Jonathan. The loss of Alistair's attention stung Jonathan, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. He was the man of the hour. He didn't need the approval of some stuffy old relic. He had the future, and she was standing right next to him, clinging to his arm. He turned his back on Annalise, leading Talia deeper into the crowd, laughing at something she whispered in his ear. Annalise was left alone in his wake, an island of sapphire silk in a turbulent sea. She watched them go, her expression unchanging. The serpent had not only entered the garden, she had been personally invited by the master of the house. The stage was now perfectly set. All that remained was for the final brutal act to begin. The evening wore on, each moment a carefully orchestrated torture for Annalise. Jonathan paraded Talia around the ballroom as if she were the guest of honor. He introduced her to board members, laughed with her by the champagne fountain, and even swayed with her for a moment when the string quartet played a waltz, a dance that was traditionally reserved for the host and his wife. Each act was a fresh twist of the knife, designed to be seen by everyone, especially by Annalise. She endured it with a preternatural calm that unsettled those who knew her well. They expected tears, a hasty departure, a confrontation. Instead, she circulated her smile, never faltering her grace, an impenetrable shield. She was a queen, observing a court coup, seemingly unbothered, which only seemed to enrage Jonathan further. He wanted a reaction. He needed to prove to himself and to Talia that he had broken her. The climax arrived just after the main speeches. Jonathan, his voice slurred slightly from an excess of vintage champagne, and self-congratulation stood on the dais, basking in the applause. He had thanked his board, his team, and his investors. As an afterthought, he had gestured vaguely in Annalise's direction and said, "And of course my wife for holding down the fort." The lukewarm acknowledgement was another calculated insult. After stepping down, he immediately made his way to Talia, who was holding court by a towering ice sculpture of the Sterling Innovations logo. It was there that he decided to stage his final unforgivable act. Annalise was speaking quietly with the wife of the French ambassador when she saw Jonathan beckoning her over. His gesture was not a polite invitation. It was an imperious summons. Excusing herself, she walked towards him, a sense of grim finality settling over her. She knew this was it, the point of no return. As she approached Talia with a theatrical little gasp, tripped. It was a clumsy, obvious motion. The glass of red wine in her hand flew forward, its contents splashing in a perfect arc across the front of Annalise's sapphire gown. The dark red stain bloomed like a grotesque flower on the expensive silk. A collective gasp went through the nearby guests. The music seemed to falter. All eyes were on the three of them. "Oh my goodness," Talia cried, her hand flying to her mouth in a parody of distress. "I am so clumsy, I've ruined your dress, your beautiful dress." Her eyes, however, danced with triumph. Annalise looked down at the stain, then back up at Talia's smirking face. She said nothing. It was an accident. Obviously. Jonathan slurred, stepping forward. He didn't look at his wife's ruined gown. He looked directly into her eyes, his own filled with a cruel, triumphant light. "But you were standing too close, Annalise. You crowded her. I think you owe Talia an apology." The demand hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Apologize for being assaulted. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. The surrounding guests shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer entertainment. It was a blood sport. Annalise's silence seemed to fuel Jonathan's rage. How dare she defy him even passively? How dare she stand there, so poised and unbroken, when he was trying so hard to shatter her? "Did you hear me?" he snarled, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "She is a guest. You have made her feel unwelcome, and now you've caused this scene. Apologize to her." Annalise met his gaze, her own eyes as clear and cold as a winter sky. "I have nothing to apologize for, Jonathan." That was it. The final defiance. The snap of his control. His face contorted into a mask of pure fury. He was drunk on power, convinced of his own invincibility in this room he had paid for, filled with people he employed or controlled. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "You will do as I say," he hissed, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear, but his intent clear to the entire room. "You have forgotten your place. It's time I reminded you." And then he uttered the unthinkable command. "Kneel!" He said the word, a venomous dart, in the sudden tomb-like silence of the ballroom. "Kneel and apologize to Miss Vance. Now." The silence was absolute. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. Every single guest was frozen, staring in disbelief. Penelope Croft's phone was held up, openly recording. Alistair Finch, standing near the edge of the crowd, looked on with an expression of cold, hard fury. Talia's smirk widened. This was beyond her wildest dreams. To have the elegant, untouchable Mrs. Sterling kneeling at her feet. It was the ultimate victory. Jonathan's grip on Annalise's arm was bruising. He was shaking with rage. "I said kneel." Annalise looked at her husband, the man she had once loved, the man who had built an empire with her money and her support. She saw him for what he truly was, a hollow, pathetic bully. So insecure in his own worth that he had to destroy hers to feel powerful. She looked at Talia, a cheap vulture, gorging on the scraps of a dying marriage. And she looked around at the faces of the New York elite, their expressions a mixture of horror, pity, and morbid curiosity. This was the moment, the one she and Genevieve had planned for, though she had never imagined it would be this grotesque, this public. He was handing her the sword and baring his own neck. Slowly, deliberately, Annalise's gaze dropped from his face. She held the eyes of the crowd for a moment, letting them bear witness. Then, with an impossible, heartbreaking grace, she sank downwards. The sapphire silk of her ruined gown pooled around her, as her knees with a soft, barely audible whisper of fabric moved towards the cold, polished marble floor. She was going to kneel. The universe seemed to hold its breath. To Jonathan, this was the moment of absolute triumph. He saw his wife, the symbol of his old life, bending to his will before his new prize. He saw her breaking. A satisfied, cruel smile spread across his face. Talia preened, puffing out her chest, ready to receive the apology she felt she was owed. Annalise's knees were inches from the floor. Her head was bowed, her auburn hair hiding her expression. The room was so quiet that the frantic, silent flashes from Penelope Croft's phone seemed to echo, but her knees never touched the marble. Just as she was about to complete the humiliating act, her descent paused. She tilted her head, not up at Jonathan, but towards the edge of the horrified circle of onlookers. Her eyes found Alistair Finch. She gave him the barest, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. "My God, Jonathan, have you lost your mind?" Alistair Finch's voice was not loud, but it sliced through the silence like a shard of ice. It was a voice accustomed to commanding boardrooms and moving markets, and it carried an undeniable weight. Every head snapped towards him. Jonathan, startled, turned to face the older man. "Alistair, this is a private matter between my wife and me." "There is nothing private about this disgusting spectacle," Alistair retorted, taking a step forward. The crowd parted for him as he approached the grim tableau. "I have known Annalise for over a decade. She is a woman of immense grace and integrity. To see her subjected to this barbarism is an insult not only to her, but to every decent person in this room." A murmur of agreement rippled through the guests. The spell of fear and morbid fascination was broken. People were no longer just watching, they were judging. As all eyes were on the confrontation between the two powerful men, Annalise began to rise. She did not get up like a victim. She rose with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen ascending her throne. The look of shame was gone, replaced by an expression of cold, terrifying serenity. She looked at her husband, whose face was now a confused mixture of anger and panic. "My husband is right," Annalise said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the ballroom. "This is a private matter. A private business matter." She reached into her small beaded clutch. Her movements were calm and precise. She withdrew the tiny encrypted USB drive. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, the small piece of plastic and metal suddenly seeming as potent as a detonator. This evening was meant to celebrate 10 years of sterling innovations. She continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. 10 years of what Jonathan likes to call his success. She took a step toward Alistair Finch, her ruined dress swishing around her. "Alistair, you were one of the first major investors, but do you know who the very first investor was? The one whose capital the entire company was founded on." Alistair looked from the USB drive to her face, his shrewd eyes beginning to understand. "I always assumed it was seed funding from a venture capital firm." "No," Annalise said, her eyes locking with Jonathan's. The color was draining from his face. He was starting to realize his profound miscalculation. The seed money was mine, an inheritance from my grandmother. Every last cent. A new wave of gasps and whispers erupted. This was not a well-known fact. Jonathan had always cultivated the story of being a self-made man who had clawed his way to the top. A fact my husband seems to have forgotten. Annalise went on her tone, turning razor-sharp. He also seems to have forgotten the clauses in the original partnership agreement, clauses that grant the foundational investor certain rights and oversight in cases of gross financial misconduct. Jonathan took a step toward her. "Annalise, what is this? What are you doing? This is not the time or the place." "Oh, I think this is the perfect time and place," a new voice cut in. Genevieve Thorne. Annalise's lawyer and friend emerged from the crowd, a tablet in her hand. She had been standing there the whole time, waiting. Since everyone is here, all the board members, all the investors. Genevieve tapped the screen of her tablet, and it lit up with spreadsheets, bank statements, and flow charts with damning arrows pointing to offshore accounts. She held it up for Alistair to see. For the past year, Genevieve announced her voice, the epitome of professional fury. Mr. Sterling has been systematically embezzling funds from Sterling Innovations, funneling millions into a series of shell corporations, one of which is conveniently registered to a Miss Talia Vance. All eyes now swiveled to Talia, whose face had gone from triumphant to ashen white. Her jaw was slack with shock. The expensive necklace around her throat suddenly looked like a millstone. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami. Seconds ago, Annalise was the one on her knees, the object of pity and scorn. Now she was the executioner, and the entire New York elite was her jury. Jonathan stood frozen between the two women, the hunter who had just realized he had walked into a perfectly laid trap. Jonathan Sterling stared at the tablet in Genevieve's hand, his mind struggling to process the information. The numbers, the account names, the dates, they were all there, stark and irrefutable. It was his entire shadow life laid bare under the glare of the crystal chandeliers. His face, which moments ago had been flushed with wine and rage, was now a ghastly, waxy white. This is slander," he stammered, his voice losing its booming authority, shrinking to a desperate rasp. "These are falsified documents, Annalise. This is insane. You're hysterical." Annalise let out a short, sharp laugh, devoid of any humor. "Hysterical? Is that what you call it, Jonathan? I call it meticulous. For 6 months while you were whining and dining your marketing consultant on company money, I was preparing for this exact moment." She turned her attention from her husband to the assembled guests, her voice resonating with a power they had never heard from her before. She was no longer the quiet, demure Mrs. Sterling. She was a woman in her own right, a woman who had come to collect a debt. Every fraudulent wire transfer, every invoice padded to pay for Miss Vance's shopping sprees in Paris, every business expense that was actually a down payment on her new condominium. "It's all there," she said, gesturing to the USB drive still held in her hand. "And on this drive is a copy which will be sent to the SEC, the IRS, and every major financial journalist in the country at 9:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. Unless, of course, a certain event were to trigger an earlier release. An event like, say, a wife being publicly humiliated and assaulted by her husband." Genevieve smiled grimly. "The email is drafted and ready to send. All it needs is my authorization." The implication was terrifyingly clear. The trap had a fail-safe. Jonathan's monstrous act of cruelty was not the catalyst for his ruin. It was merely the trigger for its public unveiling. Annalise had been in control the entire time. Alistair Finch looked from the tablet back to Jonathan, his face a mask of cold fury. "Is this true, Jonathan?" "Of course not. She's a scorned woman, trying to ruin me," Jonathan pleaded, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally, for someone who would believe him. He found no one. He saw only disgust, condemnation, and in the eyes of his fellow board members, pure, unadulterated fear. Their own reputations were now tied to his sinking ship. Scorned. Annalise's voice dropped, becoming intensely personal. "Oh, I am far beyond scorn, Jonathan. Do you remember what you told me when I first gave you my inheritance? You said you would build us an empire. You built one for yourself on a foundation of my trust, and you have spent the last few years trying to burn it to the ground. I am simply refusing to let you take me with you." She then looked directly at Talia, who was trying to shrink back into the crowd to become invisible. "And you," Annalise said, her voice laced with a chilling pity. "Did you really think he would leave me for you?" Men like Jonathan don't trade one wife for another. They just acquire newer, more expensive assets. You were an asset Ms. Vance purchased with stolen funds. And now you are a co-conspirator in a federal fraud investigation. I hope the condo was worth it." Talia let out a small, strangled sob and turned to run, but her path was blocked by two stern-looking hotel security guards who had been quietly summoned by Alistair Finch. The ballroom was in chaos. The polite murmur had transformed into a cacophony of frantic, hushed conversations. Investors were on their phones, their voices sharp with panic. "Sell everything," one man hissed into his phone. "Short it, if you can. It's over." Penelope Croft was a blur of motion, her fingers flying across her screen, live blogging the most spectacular high society implosion in a generation. Her post, titled "Sterling Innovations Implodes CEO, Accused of Fraud Assaults, Wife at Anniversary Gala," was already going viral. Jonathan looked around wildly, his empire crumbling in real time. The adoration and respect he had craved, the power he had wielded so arrogantly, it all evaporated in the space of 10 minutes. He was no longer a king in his castle. He was a common criminal, exposed in the stocks. He turned back to Annalise, his face a grotesque canvas of desperation and disbelief. "Annalise, please," he begged, the word catching in his throat. "We can talk about this. Don't do this." Annalise looked at the man before her, the man who had demanded she kneel, and felt nothing but a vast, empty peace. The love had died long ago. The anger had been forged into a weapon, and that weapon had found its mark. All that was left was the finality of it all. She walked past him, pausing only when she was shoulder to shoulder with him. She didn't look at him. She spoke softly for his ears only. "You demanded I get on my knees, Jonathan," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "But you are the one who will spend the rest of your life begging." With that, she continued walking, her head held high, the red wine stain on her dress. No longer a mark of shame, but a badge of victory. She walked towards the grand doors of the ballroom, leaving her husband standing alone in the center of his ruined kingdom, the architect of his own spectacular demise. Annalise didn't run. She walked. Her pace was even and unhurried as she crossed the vast expanse of the ballroom floor. The crowd, a roiling sea of shock and schadenfreude, parted for her, as if she were royalty. No one spoke to her, but every eye followed her progress. They weren't just watching a woman leave a party. They were witnessing the end of an era. The Sterling era. As she reached the towering, ornate doors, Genevieve fell into step beside her. She placed a comforting hand on Annalise's arm. "The car is waiting downstairs. I've already spoken to the head of hotel security. They will detain Ms. Vance for the police who have been discreetly notified of a public disturbance." Annalise nodded, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "You think of everything, Jen. It's my job," Genevieve said, squeezing her arm gently. "Are you all right?" "I will be," Annalise replied, and for the first time in years, she knew it was the truth. They pushed through the doors into the grand hallway, the cacophony of the ballroom fading behind them, replaced by the hushed, opulent silence of the hotel. They didn't look back. Inside the ballroom, Jonathan Sterling was a man adrift. The invisible shield of his power and wealth had been shattered, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. His board members, men who had clapped him on the back an hour earlier, now avoided his gaze, huddled together in a tight, panicked circle, plotting how to distance themselves and the company from him. Their loyalty, he was learning too late, was only to the bottom line. Alistair Finch strode over to him, his face carved from granite. "You are a disgrace, Jonathan. Not just to your wife, but to the entire business community. My fund will be divesting its entire position in Sterling Innovations at market open. I will personally see to it that you are removed from the board and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." "Alistair, you can't," Jonathan began, his voice pleading. "I can and I will," Alistair said, cutting him off. "You built your house on sand, and you were foolish enough to cause a storm." He turned his back on Jonathan and walked away, making a call as he went, no doubt, to his legal team. Jonathan's frantic gaze fell upon Talia. She was crying, her mascara running in black streaks down her face, pleading with the security guards who blocked her path. "I didn't know," she wailed, pointing a trembling, red-nailed finger at Jonathan. "He told me the money was his. He lied to me. It was all him." The last person she had in the world, the person for whom he had thrown everything away, was now turning on him to save herself. The betrayal was so absolute, so swift, that Jonathan could only stare, dumbfounded. The serpent was eating its own tail. Guests began to flee the party as if it were a sinking ship. The atmosphere of celebration had curdled into something toxic and grim. They wanted to be gone before the full fallout landed, before they were photographed near the wreckage. The exodus was swift and merciless. Within 15 minutes, the grand ballroom, which had been packed with the city's most powerful people, was half empty. The remaining knots of people spoke in hushed, urgent tones, the news of the scandal spreading through the city's elite network via encrypted texts and frantic calls. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and vanished. The waiters stood awkwardly by the walls, unsure of what to do. The lavish food displays were left untouched. The towering ice sculpture of the Sterling Innovations logo had begun to melt, dripping steadily onto the polished floor, the letters losing their sharp, proud edges, slowly dissolving into a meaningless puddle. Jonathan stood alone in the middle of the room, the abandoned master of ceremonies. The lights of the chandeliers seemed to mock him, illuminating his utter desolation. He had orchestrated the entire evening to be the pinnacle of his glory, and it had become his public guillotine. He had tried to force his wife to her knees, and in doing so had brought his entire world crashing down on top of him. He sank onto the edge of the empty dais, the spot where he had given his triumphant speech, and buried his face in his hands. The only sound was the steady, quiet drip, drip, drip of his melting legacy. 3 months later, the view from Annalise's new apartment was different. Instead of the glittering, overwhelming sprawl of midtown Manhattan, she looked out over the serene, green expanse of Central Park. The autumn leaves were a riot of gold, crimson, and orange, a vibrant, living painting that changed with the light. The air in the spacious, light-filled apartment felt clean, untainted by the ghosts of betrayal and sorrow. The Eternity's Cascade necklace was gone. She had sold it along with every other piece of jewelry Jonathan had ever given her. The proceeds had been used to establish a foundation, the Phoenix Fund, dedicated to providing legal and financial resources for women escaping abusive and controlling relationships. Her story, once a salacious headline, had become a source of inspiration. The headlines themselves had been relentless. Sterling CEO indicted on fraud embezzlement charges. Sterling Innovations files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Socialite Talia Vance pleads guilty to conspiracy, avoids jail time with testimony. Jonathan's fall had been as swift and brutal as she had planned. Stripped of his CEO title and board seat, he was a pariah in the city that had once revered him. His assets were frozen, his friends had vanished, and his legal bills were astronomical. The photos from that night of his furious face, of Annalise's calm resolve, of Talia's panicked tears, were etched into the public consciousness. He was no longer a titan. He was a cautionary tale. Annalise had been forced to testify, a process that was painful but cathartic. She had walked into the courtroom, not as a victim, but as the primary architect of the prosecution's case. Her meticulous records, verified by Genevieve's forensic team, had been undeniable. The partnership agreement she had signed all those years ago had held up in court, making her the primary creditor in the bankruptcy proceedings. She had not only reclaimed her initial investment, but through a series of shrewd legal maneuvers, by Genevieve had managed to salvage a significant portion of the company's viable assets, which she was now in the process of restructuring into a new ethical and more transparent enterprise under her own leadership. She sat at a simple oak desk by the window, a cup of tea steaming beside her, sketching out a business plan. She wasn't wearing diamonds or designer gowns. She was in comfortable cashmere and jeans, her hair falling loosely around her shoulders. She looked younger, more vibrant than she had in years. The mask was gone. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Alistair Finch. "The new board has approved your proposal. Congratulations, Madam Chairwoman. Well deserved." A genuine smile, warm and bright, spread across her face. She had not just survived. She was prevailing. She had torn down the gilded cage and was now building her own world, a world based not on dominance and deceit, but on integrity and strength. She looked out the window again at the people strolling through the park below. They were all living their own stories, filled with their own triumphs and heartbreaks. Her story had been one of pain and revenge, but she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was not the end. The revenge was simply the clearing of the rubble. This new dawn, with the sun streaming through her window and a future of her own making before her, was the true beginning. The quiet woman Jonathan Sterling had tried to break had finally found her voice, and she was ready to build an empire of her own. 6 months had passed since the gala. 6 months of legal battles, sensational headlines, and the slow, arduous process of dismantling one life to build another. Annalise now measured time not by society events or board meetings, but by the small, tangible milestones of her own making the first successful funding round for her new company. The first woman her foundation helped find a safe home. The first time she woke up, and the ghost of Jonathan wasn't the first thing on her mind. She was meeting Genevieve for lunch at a small, sun-drenched cafe in the West Village, a place with ivy-covered brick walls and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. It was her new favorite spot, a world away from the stuffy, power-soaked restaurants she used to frequent. She was early, and as she savored a cup of black coffee, her phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. Her heart gave a familiar, unwelcome jolt a phantom limb of anxiety from her past life. The message was brief. "I saw you go in. Can I have 5 minutes? They're sentencing me next week. Please." She didn't need to ask who it was. Annalise looked up, her eyes scanning the street through the large plate-glass window. And there he was. Jonathan. He stood across the road, a ghost in broad daylight. The impeccable Tom Ford suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled, ill-fitting coat. He was thinner, his face gaunt and sallow. The arrogant posture he once held, now replaced by a defeated slump. He looked like a man hollowed out from the inside, the swagger and power stripped away, leaving only the brittle shell behind. Her first instinct was to ignore him, to delete the message and signal for the check. Genevieve would be furious, she even considered it. But as she looked at the pathetic figure he cut, she felt not fear or anger, but a strange, clinical curiosity. This was the final chapter she hadn't known she needed to write. She typed a reply. 5 minutes. Stay where you are. I'll come out. She left a $20 bill on the table, sent a quick text to Genevieve to meet her at the park entrance nearby, and walked out of the cafe, her coat pulled tight against the crisp autumn air. She crossed the street, stopping a respectable distance from him. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now couldn't even meet her eyes. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice raspy. "What do you want?" Jonathan Annalise asked, her tone even betraying no emotion. He finally looked up, and she was struck by the emptiness in his eyes. The furor, the cruelty, the ambition, it was all gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading vacancy. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." The words sounded foreign, clumsy on his tongue. Annalise waited. She knew there was more. With Jonathan, there was always an angle. "I know I messed up," he continued, his words stumbling over each other. "I got caught up in it all. The money, the power, it changes you. It wasn't me, Annalise, not the real me, not the man you married." He was trying to conjure the ghost of their past, of the young, ambitious couple who had started with nothing but her inheritance and his dreams. But that man was long dead, if he had ever truly existed at all. "The man I married would never have demanded I kneel before another woman. Jonathan," she said calmly, "the power didn't change you. It revealed you." His face fell. The wall of her composure was impenetrable. He abandoned the pretense of a simple apology and got to the heart of his plea. "They're going to send me away for years. My lawyer says a letter could help. A character statement from you. If you could just tell the judge about the good years, about the company we built. Tell him that I'm not a monster." There it was. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry for the consequences. He didn't want forgiveness. He wanted a get-out-of-jail-free card. Annalise looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she felt a sliver of something akin to pity. Not for his situation, but for the profound emptiness of his soul. He had learned nothing. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. "No," he repeated, disbelief warring with desperation. "Annalise, after everything, all the years, you would see me rot in a cell. Is that the revenge you want?" This was never about revenge. "Jonathan," she said, and the truth of it resonated within her. The spectacle at the gala, that was survival. That was me taking a public execution you had planned for me and turning it into my declaration of independence. Everything since has been about reclaiming the life and the assets you stole. It was never about watching you rot. Your fate is of your own making." She took a step closer, her voice dropping slightly. "You want me to tell the judge you're not a monster. I can't. Because a man who would systematically break down his wife's spirit for his own ego, who would try to humiliate her in the most degrading way possible, is a monster. He just hides it well behind expensive suits. You didn't just cheat, Jonathan. You didn't just steal. You tried to erase me. You thought I was nothing more than an object you owned, and you were furious when the object developed a will of its own." He flinched as if she had struck him. Her words were not angry. They were facts delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I will not write a letter," she finished. "You have to face what you've done. That is the only path to any kind of redemption. It's not my job to save you from your consequences. My job is to live the life you tried to take from me." She turned to walk away. "Annalise, wait!" he cried out, his voice cracking. "Don't I deserve a second chance?" She paused but didn't turn back. "Yes," she said over her shoulder. "You do. And it will begin the day you walk out of prison. Until then, you have nothing but first chances to understand why you're there in the first place." With that, she walked away, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk. She didn't look back. She walked towards the park where the sun was shining and her friend was waiting. She felt no lingering anger, no satisfying thrill of victory. She felt only a profound and final sense of closure. The last chain had been broken. The ghost was gone. And ahead of her, the path was clear sunlit and entirely her own. Annalise Sterling's story is a powerful reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the most observant. She endured betrayal and public humiliation, but she never surrendered her power. She simply waited for the perfect moment to reclaim it. Jonathan Sterling, blinded by his own arrogance, built a prison for his wife, never realizing she held the keys all along. His demand for her to kneel was not a show of strength, but a fatal act of desperation that triggered his own downfall. Did Jonathan get what he deserved? Was Annalise's revenge justified, or was it just as cold and calculated as his own cruelty? We all face moments where we feel powerless, but this story shows that with intelligence, patience, and courage, it's possible to turn the tables in the most spectacular way. What did you think of Annalise's strategy? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice and empowerment, please hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more tales of epic revenge and triumphant survival.